The wind tore across the Kansas prairie in June 1887, rattling the windows of the one-room schoolhouse in Meadowbrook. Margaret Thornton stood at the front, hands folded, dark hair in a practical bun. At 27, she had taught here for 3 years. Her students ranged from 6-year-old Lucy Miller to 19-year-old Daniel Brennan, who occupied the back row and should have graduated years ago if his father hadn't needed him on the ranch. If you're craving stories of forbidden romance and frontier passion, you're in the right place. Keep reading to discover how one desperate lie transformed into the love of a lifetime. Eyes on your slates, Margaret said steadily. The wind will pass. Daniel glanced up, met her eyes for a heartbeat, then looked down. Something in that glance made Margaret's pulse quicken in a way she refused to acknowledge. Outside, the stagecoach rattled past. Margaret knew another parcel might be waiting. Over 2 months, packages had arrived at the general store. First came lace gloves finer than anything sold locally. Second, a silver brooch shaped like a rose. Third, a letter of transfer for a mare named Rosalind, stabled at the livery and paid through year's end. Each gift included a note in elegant script signed by Harrison Whitfield, a cattleman managing holdings in Wyoming and Nebraska, who apologized repeatedly for his inability to visit due to business complications. Margaret had never met Harrison Whitfield. His replies were warm, articulate, and curiously evasive. He praised her intellect and dedication. He wrote of loneliness and dreams of a home with a woman of substance. He promised to visit, then delayed, then promised again. The townspeople noticed. In Meadowbrook, a school teacher receiving gifts from a mysterious suitor was endless speculation. Margaret heard the whispers but said nothing. The gifts were real. The mare was real. Yet something felt unfinished. Daniel lingered after school, as he often did, straightening benches and checking the stove. "Hinge is loose on the coal scuttle," Daniel said, crouching beside it. "I'll bring a screwdriver tomorrow." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice softer than intended. Daniel stood, brushing coal dust from his hands. He was tall, nearly 6 feet, with dark blonde hair and eyes the color of wheat fields. He looked at her the way a man looks at a woman, not a student at a teacher, and Margaret felt heat rise in her face. "Stagecoach came through," Daniel said. Samuel was waving a package around. "I'll collect it tomorrow." "Folks talk. They say you have a rich beau in Wyoming." Margaret met his eyes. "I have a correspondent, that's all." Daniel's mouth twitched. "Correspondent who sends gloves and horses. Is that your business?" "No, ma'am." He picked up his hat. "For what it's worth, I think a man who courts a woman ought to show his face. Gifts are easy. Showing up is harder." He left before Margaret could reply. The next morning, Margaret collected the package. Inside was a silver hairpin set with a moonstone. The note read, "For a woman whose grace outshines the moon, I regret another delay. Railroad trouble in Omaha. Yours in anticipation, Harrison Whitfield." Over the following week, Daniel continued arriving early and leaving late. He fixed the loose hinge. He replaced a cracked window pane. Each small task brought him closer to her. One rainy afternoon, Daniel stayed after other students left, working through a geometry problem. "You have it backwards," Margaret said, stepping beside him. "The angle is supplementary, not complementary." Daniel tried again. Margaret stood close enough to smell rain on his shirt, close enough to feel warmth radiating from his shoulder. "There," Daniel said, finishing the problem. "That right?" "Yes. Well done." Daniel turned to face her. They were very close now. "You're good at a lot of things," he said quietly. "Mr. Brennan." "Daniel?" "That wouldn't be appropriate." Before Margaret could continue, the door banged open and Marcus Caldwell stumbled in, soaked and carrying a bedraggled bouquet. He slipped on the wet threshold and crashed into the coat rack. "Brought you flowers," Marcus gasped. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a laugh. Daniel turned away, shoulders shaking. Marcus fled into the rain. Then Daniel laughed, a real laugh that filled the room. Daniel's smile faded. He looked at her with intensity that made her breath catch. "I should go home," he said. "Yes," Margaret whispered. He left without another word. "Are you hooked yet?" This story gets even more scandalous. Don't miss what happens when Margaret discovers the shocking truth about her mysterious suitor. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August. Inside was a brief note and a diamond ring set in gold. The note read, "Miss Thornton, I offer you my hand in marriage." I am unable to attend the ceremony myself due to obligations I cannot postpone, but my father, Owen Brennan, will stand in my stead. The marriage will be legal and binding, and I will join you in Meadowbrook immediately afterward. If you accept, wear this ring and meet me through my father at the church this Saturday at 4 o'clock. Yours in earnest hope, Harrison Whitfield. A proxy marriage. Margaret's mind spun. She wore the ring to school the next day. By lunchtime, the entire town knew. That evening, Daniel appeared at her door. "You're getting married," he said. "Yes. To a man you've never met." "I know him through his letters." "Letters?" Daniel laughed, bitter and sharp. "You're marrying words on paper. That's my choice." "Is it?" He stepped closer. "You deserve better than this. You deserve someone who shows up, who stands beside you, who doesn't hide behind letters and excuses." "Like you?" Margaret asked. "Yes, like me." The air between them crackled. "You're 19 years old," she said quietly. "I'm 27. I'm your teacher. This cannot happen." "Why not?" "Because it's improper. Because people will talk. Because you're afraid," Daniel finished. Daniel studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, marry your stranger. I hope he makes you happy." He walked away into twilight. Saturday arrived hot and still, the church filled with townspeople. Margaret wore a simple dress of pale blue. Reverend Gray stood at the front, Bible open. Beside him stood a tall, silver-haired man with broad shoulders. "Miss Thornton," the man said, "I'm Owen Brennan. I'm honored to stand for my son." Margaret shook his hand. "Your son is Harrison Whitfield?" "No." Owen's expression flickered. "My son chose a name for his correspondence. His true name is Daniel Brennan." The church went utterly silent. Margaret stared at Owen, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. "My son is Daniel Brennan," Owen repeated. "He's 19 years old. He attends your school, and he's been courting you under a false name for 4 months." The silence shattered. Voices erupted from every corner. Margaret couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "The boy's in love," Owen said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He was afraid she'd never consider him because of his age. So he created a fiction to win her attention. It was foolish. It was desperate. But it was real. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Outside," Owen said. "He was afraid to face you." Margaret lifted her skirts and walked down the aisle. She pushed through the church doors and found Daniel standing beside the hitching post, face pale, hands shaking. They stared at each other. "You lied to me," Margaret said. "Yes. For months. Yes. You made a fool of me." Daniel flinched. "I never meant. You made me fall in love with words written by a coward." "I know." Margaret stepped closer, hands clenched into fists. "Why?" "Because you would never have looked at me otherwise," Daniel said, voice cracking. "I'm 19. I'm your student. I have nothing to offer but a share in my father's ranch and calloused hands. But I love you, Margaret. I've loved you since the first day I walked into that schoolhouse. I tried to stop. I tried to keep away. But every time I saw you, every time I heard your voice..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I wrote those letters because I thought if you could love the man in the words, maybe someday you could love the man standing in front of you." Margaret's anger warred with something else, something warm and terrible and impossibly tender. "You should have told me the truth." "Would you have given me a chance?" She opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it. They both knew the answer. Behind them, Dorothy poked her head out. "So, are we having a wedding or not?" Margaret turned to look at the crowd. She looked back at Daniel. "You wrote all those letters? Every word?" "Every word. The gloves, the brooch, the mare. I worked extra at the ranch, sold my saddle, borrowed from my father." Despite everything, Margaret felt a laugh bubbling up. It came out strangled, half sob, half giggle. "You're an idiot. Yes, ma'am. A lying, scheming, ridiculous idiot. Yes, ma'am. And I should send you home and never speak to you again." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked at the ring on her finger, then at Daniel's face. "But you wrote those letters. You chose every word." "I meant every word." This is where everything changes. Stay with us to see how Margaret's decision transforms not just her life, but an entire town's understanding of love itself. Reverend Gray cleared his throat. "Miss Thornton, legally, you're married. However, given the circumstances, the church would understand if you wished to seek an annulment." Margaret didn't look away from Daniel. "And if I don't seek an annulment, then you're Mrs. Brennan." Margaret's heart hammered. This was madness. She had been tricked, humiliated. Every sensible part of her screamed to walk away. But another part, the part that had laughed with Daniel in the rain, that had felt her pulse jump when his hand brushed hers, that had read those beautiful letters and felt seen in a way she'd never felt before, that part whispered something different. "I need time," Margaret said finally. "I need time to think." Daniel nodded. "I'll wait as long as you need." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel proved himself with small, stubborn acts. He repaired her loose porch step. He left firewood stacked by her door. He weeded her vegetable patch. On the 15th day, she opened the door before he could leave. "You're persistent." "Yes, ma'am." "Come inside." They sat at the table. "Tell me something true. Something you've never told anyone." Daniel thought for a moment. "I hate working cattle. What I really want is to raise horses. Good horses, but my father thinks it's impractical, so I've never said it out loud before now." Margaret blinked, surprised. "Horses? I like how they think, how they learn. You can build something with a horse. A partnership." He looked embarrassed. "That probably sounds foolish." "No," Margaret said. "It sounds like you." Their eyes met and held. Margaret felt the pull again. This time she didn't look away. "I'm still angry with you," she said. "I know, but I think I might be willing to try, to see if we can make this real." Daniel's face lit up like sunrise. "Truly?" "Truly, but no more lies, ever. If we're going to do this, it has to be honest." "No more lies," Daniel promised. "I swear on my mother's memory." Margaret stood and extended her hand. Daniel took it, and they shook formally, sealing their strange new bargain. 2 months later, Margaret moved into the Brennan Ranch house. That first night, they lay in bed together, both nervous. The space between them felt vast. "We're married," Margaret whispered. "We might as well learn how to be." Daniel reached across the space, his hand brushing her arm, sliding down to her waist. Margaret didn't pull away. She shifted closer until his breath stirred her hair. His lips grazed her temple, hesitant, then lingered. Her fingers curled into his shirt, tugging him nearer. The gap between them closed, replaced by warmth and the strength of his body against hers. They didn't rush. It was awkward, tender, and achingly real. The days developed a rhythm. Margaret continued teaching, riding Rosalind into town each morning. Daniel worked the ranch with his father. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Daniel on a cold November evening as snow began to fall. He stared at her, mouth open, then picked her up and spun her around until she shrieked with laughter. The ranch prospered. Owen, seeing Daniel's gift with horses, finally agreed to let him start a breeding program. Over the years, 3 children arrived: Clara, Samuel, and Josephine. The house grew crowded and loud and full of life. 10 years after the wedding that wasn't quite a wedding, Margaret and Daniel sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. The children were finally asleep. Owen had retired to his room. The ranch was quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. "I was thinking about that day," Daniel said, "the wedding day, when I thought you'd leave me." Margaret leaned against his shoulder. "I almost did." "I know." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Then Margaret said, "Do you ever regret it?" "The lie?" Daniel thought carefully. "I regret the pain it caused you. I regret the humiliation." He turned to look at her. "But I don't regret the outcome. I can't regret what came from it." He gestured to the house, the land, the life they'd built. "All of this, Clara and Samuel and Josephine. 10 years of watching you teach our children to read. 10 years of falling asleep beside you and waking up knowing you're still there. I can't regret something that led to this." Margaret's eyes stung. "You hurt me, Daniel. For a long time I couldn't trust my own feelings." "I know, and I'm sorry. I'll be sorry for that until the day I die." He took her hand. "But I hope I've spent the last 10 years showing you that my love, at least, was always real. Even when the name was false, even when I was too cowardly to show my face, the love was real." Margaret thought about the years that had passed, the small kindnesses, the steady presence, the way Daniel had learned to be honest even when honesty was hard. The way he looked at her every morning, as if she was still a miracle he couldn't quite believe in. "You've shown me," she said softly. "Every day for 10 years, you've shown me." Was it enough? It was more than enough. In the distance, a coyote howled. The stars began to appear, scattered like seeds across the darkening sky. Inside the house, one of the children cried out in sleep, then settled again. "Are we happy, Margaret?" Daniel asked. She looked at him. This man who had once been a boy, desperate enough to invent a whole person just to win her attention, who had worked himself ragged trying to prove his worth, who had learned slowly and sometimes painfully how to be a partner, who still wrote her notes sometimes. Little scraps of paper tucked into her lesson books, because words came easier to him than speech, and he wanted to make sure she knew she was loved. "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes, we're happy." "Good." Daniel kissed her forehead. "That's all I ever wanted." "Liar, you wanted a lot more than that." "All right, yes, I wanted you specifically. I wanted this life. I wanted everything we have built," he grinned. "But mostly I wanted you." Shameless. Always. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky. Down the road they could see the lights of Meadowbrook twinkling to life. The town that had once whispered about them now simply accepted them as part of the landscape. The teacher and the rancher's son who had started all wrong and somehow ended up right. Margaret watched Daniel, with their son Samuel on his lap earlier. Father and son outlined against the lamplight, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for every messy, imperfect moment that brought them here. Daniel helped Margaret unpin her hair that night, his fingers gentle and practiced. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. "No regrets," he whispered. "None worth counting," she replied. They climbed into bed, and for a moment they were simply two people who had found each other through deceit and determination and impossible luck, who had built something real from a foundation of lies, who had learned that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other again and again. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars. Inside, the Brennan family slept, wrapped in the ordinary magic of home. And in the morning, when the rooster crowed and children thundered down the stairs and coffee boiled on the stove, Margaret would look across the breakfast table at the man who had once been desperate enough to invent himself a new name just to win her, and she would smile. Because some stories begin with deception and end with truth. Some love affairs start backwards and arrive at exactly the right place. And some 19-year-old ranch boys grow into men worth spending a lifetime beside. The wind rose over the Kansas prairie, sweeping across the land where a schoolteacher and a rancher's son had turned scandal into something lasting, where a lie had become the foundation for a life built on honesty, where the most improper beginning had led to the most proper of endings. A house full of laughter, land full of promise, and two hearts that had finally learned how to be home to each other.